Today we had an interesting event in the European Parliament on the question of EU sanctions that are being imposed on individual persons for on the grounds of spreading disinformation and hybrid threats. And we had interesting guests, one of them being Hussein Dogru, who has been sanctioned since last May. So he has been sanctioned for a year already, who we invited to the European Parliament. But unfortunately, he was unable to come to the European Parliament because nobody felt in charge of granting him permission to actually cross the borders. This is part of the sanctions regime the EU has imposed on him, that he cannot cross borders. And so he was remotely a part of the discussion. We also had two guests present here. One providing a legal perspective, Alexandra Hofer, who is an assistant professor of international law at the University of Utrecht. And the other one being Juan Branco, who is dealing with the case of Natalie Yam, who has been put under sanctions since June 2025. Also present in this discussion is Florian Warweg. He's a journalist from Germany, reporting for the Ostdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, a new newspaper dealing with, based in Eastern Germany. And I would like to first speak with Alexandra Hofer about the questions that she contributed to the discussion about the effect the sanctions regime of the EU has on the fulfillment of human rights and on international law. And so how do you see this, the way the EU is proceeding concerning individuals, imposing individual sanctions on people? What effect does this have if you connected to the enjoyment of basic fundamental law?
So I would say that there is, an inherent tension when it comes to the EU's imposition of sanctions, because very often it does this in order to enforce international law or defend human rights, especially abroad. Or even in some cases that with the sanctions we're talking about today, it very much has to do with defending the EU's security. They also talk about defending the EU's democracy, the rule of law within the EU. But this often comes at the price of restricting the human rights of the individual that is being targeted by the sanctions. If we talk about an asset freeze, the individual does not have access to their property, to their bank accounts. And if you're talking about the case of a travel ban, this can, of course, restrict the freedom of movement of an individual. It can affect their right to family. Being listed can affect the individual's reputation. So by their very nature, sanctions entail the restriction of fundamental human rights. The whole question is whether or not this restriction is justified. Because, there can be limitations in the exercise of human rights if, for example, in the case of the Council of the EU, is pursuing a legitimate aim. So you first have to check what is the goal being pursued by the Council. Is the restriction, so the sanction, provided by law? Very often it is. You can question whether or not it's respecting the principle of legality. So whether or not the designation criteria is sufficiently clear so that individuals know that through their behavior or their conduct, they may run the risk of being sanctioned. But very often, individuals will argue before the Court of Justice that the sanction is having a disproportionate effect. And so that's the whole thing, is whether or not the sanction is a proportionate tool that the Council is using in order to achieve these broader political objectives. So is the cost imposed on the individual disproportionate or not?
And we were dealing with specifically with the question of Hussein Dogo, the Berlin journalist who has reported primarily on Gaza and the protests against the Gaza war. And also about Jacques Beau, who is a Swiss author and used to work also for the UN and NATO and has delivered analysis on the Ukraine war. And do you see that there is a proportionality in imposing sanctions in those cases?
So not even in these cases, but even if we talk, so I'm just going to sidestep, but I always think that there is an issue of proportionality with sanctions, because for me, in order for a sanction to be proportionate, there has to really be a link between the individual that is targeted and the behavior that the Council of the EU wishes to change. And oftentimes, I don't find that there necessarily is a link. So, for example, if the EU decides to sanction Russian oligarchs, often it's because they're very wealthy. So the idea is that through their wealth, they are somehow contributing indirectly to the Russian economy, which is enabling Russia then to attack Ukraine. But for me, in order for it really to be proportionate, there would have to be, let's say, the individual sanctioned would have to have some sort of influence on the decision or the policy that the EU wishes to pursue. And in my perspective, a lot of the individuals that are targeted are too far removed from the actual conduct. So I don't think that that's a proportionate restriction. But the Court of Justice of the EU often has a very different opinion and has always found so far that sanctions are proportionate. Now, when it comes to the specific case of the sanctions against Hussein Dogo and Jacques Beau, and we also spoke about the case of Nathalie Yam, I find that the sanctions are disproportionate, and I think it's difficult to argue that they're even necessary, because for the Council, the purpose of these sanctions is to prevent Russian destabilizing activities. So I would suspect that there should be a link between the individual listed and the Russian government. If I look at the statement of reasons that is given in the annex and explains why these individuals have been listed, I personally don't see a clear link between the individuals listed and Russia. What I see is individuals that have expressed a certain opinion, maybe give a narrative that perhaps undermines the image or that the Council wishes to portray, and therefore the Council somehow thinks that this criticism, we could call it, or this counter-narrative undermines the European Union somehow, and somehow indirectly contributes to Russia's destabilizing activities. But I think in this case, the Council has taken it really far in essentially labeling or sanctioning counter-narratives in a way that really hurts the freedom of expression.
And do you think that in a way, what are the ways of in what way would you be able to actually utter this position that it's going too far in a court case? What is the ruling of the court based on?
So you mean if you're a lawyer and you're pleading before the court, like how would you argue that it's gone too far?
Yes.
Or, yeah. So I don't have any experience with pleading in EU sanctions case, but I think what I would argue, you would maybe try to capture the language that the court has used in previous cases. So, for example, it likes the phrase whether or not the designation criteria, so the listing criteria, is manifestly inappropriate in comparison, when compared to the objective pursuit. So maybe you would try to frame it as this is a manifestly inappropriate restriction that's being imposed. You might want to say, well, the designating criteria isn't specific enough. That could be a way.
But how come the EU actually has the power to go about like that? Is the reasoning behind it? Is it precisely phrased, or in what way can they actually go about to sanction on, as you said, in concrete forms in the case of journalists, of journalistic reporting?
Well, there's Article 29 of the Treaty European Union that basically gives the Council of the EU this power to essentially adopt these restrictive measures against any individuals that it sees fit. And so the Court of Justice has always recognized that the Council has a broad discretion. And so it's because the Council has this broad discretion that it has been able to design such broad listing criteria. So the question is whether or not, and so far the Court of Justice hasn't really gone that far in pushing back against the designating criteria. It has, in some cases, said that individuals cannot be sanctioned just because they are the family member. Mm-hmm. So that could be interpreted as, a limit on, you can't just sanction a family member. You have to show that there's other conditions or criteria that are met. So it'd be interesting to see how the Court of Justice will tackle this criteria.
All right.
And the court, might want, let's say, what it could do is it could say, well, the council hasn't provided enough evidence. So that's usually why individuals are delisted, is because the evidence given by the council doesn't substantiate the statement of facts. So the court, let's say they want to delist or they think there should be a delisting, it might play it safe and say, well, the council just hasn't provided the evidence. And therefore, it doesn't have to get into questioning the designating criteria, or it doesn't have to make almost a landmark decision that the sanction is disproportionate.
And do you see a development that there is more sanctioning taking place, or that the original idea of sanctioning is actually what the EU is lining up? Because it's usually, it used to come from sanctioning states as in conflict situations. And how do you regard that in these cases?
Yeah, the EU has been, let's say, quite creative in the sanctions regimes that it has. So perhaps at first, there was also the UN Security Council that was sanctioning conflict situations, so rebel groups involved in a civil war. There was also the counter-terrorist sanctions, but the EU has also created a list against weapons proliferation. It has targeted individuals who it believes is involved in corruption in third states. It has the Global Human Rights Act, so to sanction human rights violators abroad. So it's not just this type of, that the sanctions are only conflict related. I think what's interesting in the sanctions that have been, the sanctions regime against Russia, is how broad the listing criteria of the Council has become. So it's really expanded the scope of actors that it is designating.
And do you regard this to be a danger to the enjoyment of freedom of the press?
The sanctions we're talking about, I think that it could really be a danger to freedom of expression and to freedom of press. Also because we see how they've been putting it in practice by sanctioning journalists, just for the information that they've been reporting on.
And Juan, you are dealing with the case of Nathalie Yam, who is not a journalist, but who is also an influential person. And why do you think she is being put on the sanctions list?
Well, she's a very influential intellectual who has been fighting for more than 20 years the neocolonialism of France in Africa, and especially in West Africa, in its former colonies. And she has triggered a broad change in the policies of those countries by influencing their people, and thus managing to fight very efficiently against representatives of those states who were very much aligned with France's interests and were involved in a lot of corruption, including political corruption. So this has triggered a huge backlash from French authorities, which have tried to undermine her capacity to take those positions, especially since they lost a lot of influence by the creation of the Alliance of the Sahelian States, which aligned in a much more multipolar perspective than before. So in this frame, they were looking for instruments to marginalize her, and they went to the Council of the European Union and they used these sanctions lists, which are related to Russia and Ukrainian conflict to go against her. Natalie Yam has always had a very neutral perspective on the conflict and more broadly about the exterior influences. She's, of course, very resentful regarding France's policies and their consequences over the years, and she has been very critical of France specifically, but she's always claimed that the liberation of the African people would pass by an autonomization towards all great powers, including Russia. She went to Russia, to Sochi, to actually deliver that speech, but that wasn't sufficient for the French authorities to consider that she was independent. So they tried to frame her in these larger influence and hybrid warfare theories and strategies that are meant to be implemented by Russia against the EU, to consider that she should be in this sanction list. But the only element that they found is that she participated in a conference in Berlin a few years ago with other German MPs, which was financed by an NGO, which itself would have had financing by Wagner, which itself would be financed by the Russian Federation. And she didn't get any fee for this conference. She just participated as a panelist, and it's yet the only link they found with Russia to generate this narrative in which she would be some kind of hidden spokesperson of the Kremlin, and thus she should be sanctioned. And so she discovered that while she was in Africa, in Kenya.
So the question is, because in Natalie's case, the peculiarity is that the EU sanctioned her, and she is not a resident living in the EU.
She's not, but she's Swiss, and
Yes.
Switzerland is enclaved in the European Union, so she cannot basically come back to her own country. So you have this extraterritorial effect, which is very strange. You're used to extraterritorial effects in the sanctions, insofar that, for example, banks don't want to deal with people under any kind of sanction list, even though the sanction list doesn't apply to their country. So, for example, she got her Swiss accounts closed, and this happens very often. But this very specific effect is that she was abroad, and you have no previous notification, and you don't have any kind of contradictory debate before the sanctions are implemented. And the sanctions are implemented out of a vote of the Council of the European Union, which is basically the foreign affairs ministries of each government. So it's a purely political decision, but with consequences that are akin or even worse than some criminal sentences, because you suddenly lose all access to your resources, and in this case you cannot come back to see your family, to reach back your work, your professional environment, and your appeals are very largely virtual. If you look at the number of appeals that have succeeded before the General Court or the appealing court, the Cour de Justice de l'Union Européenne, you discover that it's not only almost impossible to win a case before those courts, but it takes years, and even if you win it, the most probable result is that they will just change the motivation, as it was said, and they will still maintain you in this indefinite in time sanction list, because it can be renewed without limits. So you not only have a very virtual capacity to appeal and try to defend your rights and be heard before a court that will actually have margins of maneuver, but you also do not know when it will end, and it can be endless. And so in this case, in theory, you have all these international conventions that protect the right to return, the right to circulate between an enclave territory and the rest of the world, and they're not being respected. They might be implemented at some point, and they might even say, actually, she could have at any point flown over, but the reality is that in the meantime, no company actually accepts for her to buy a ticket and so forth, because the texts are very ambiguous. And so, and the last huge issue, in my opinion, is this hybrid warfare notion, because you have an international law system that has been theorized for centuries and has been implemented more strictly for a few decades, in which you have a definition of war, a definition of different notions that are completely evaded by this exceptionalism that has now been expanded through this hybrid warfare notion, which allows you to circumvent any kind of protections of freedom of speech, because anything could be qualified as such, as a hybrid warfare technique. And this shows, in my opinion, a lack of confidence in our own democracy and in our own capacity to respond to attempts to influence our system or to try to build resistances from within our societies to our own civilization. And the most ironic part is that when you look at the evidence that are provided, it's only articles and blog posts and so forth. Most of them are generated by NATO financed think tanks.
But is it available? Can everybody look at this?
I mean, it's ambiguous. It's not public, but it cannot. The evidence that the Council relies on can only be public publications. So it cannot be. You cannot. They cannot rely on criminal investigations or on secret services evidence, at least not formally. Actually,
so this means they are using articles that are I don't know, Twitter posts or whatever.
Actually, yes. I mean, in Nathalie Yomb, it's a Twitter post from some PhD student which has half of the elements wrong, which he published in a blog.
But you would, in every member state and also in Switzerland, you have rules. So if you do something that is punishable, then you would have to go to court.
And you can never be judged by hearsay normally.
Yes,
this is
exactly.
a fundamental right that you need to have hard evidence or witnesses that you can confront. This is just public hearsay. And with a biased approach, of course, because there is an interest in nourishing the narrative that we would be in conflict with. I mean, this is also the fundamental element. We're not at war with Russia. If any of the EU member states had declared war or had been declared war with Russia, all this could be maybe justificable. I mean, we could elaborate on whether this was a justification.
But you would need laws.
But you would need law, and you would need an act that would be validated by the parliament of the nation state and eventually by the EU institutions. And they escape all these collective deliberations and all these processes that are meant to make sure that this exceptionalism only happens in exceptional circumstances, which are very, very strictly defined, to actually be able now today to deprive, with an extraterritorial effect, foreign citizens of their most fundamental rights to start with, and more EU citizens, as we're seeing now with Jacques and Hussein and a few others.
So why do you think the EU member states do not do not use the normal way of procedures in the legal systems within the country?
So I think because people like Nathalie Yomb, to start with, are innocent of any thing that they can be accused of from a criminal perspective. They haven't committed anything illegal to start with. And secondly, I think the member states and the EU authorities want to avoid any deliberation about whether we should go to war with Russia, or even whether the policies we have adopted towards Ukraine are the right ones or not. Like we've not seen actual debate, for example, in France regarding these issues. It has only been decided unilaterally by the head of state, whom of course wasn't elected over any of those subjects. And I think it's the case in most of EU countries. And maybe they're afraid that if there was deliberation, maybe those policies would be disavowed, and maybe we would choose another path. So attacking anyone who could propose an alternative narrative and reinforce not only the criticism about the policies per se, but about the legitimacy of those institutions which have chosen this path without previous consultation of the people and without public discussion about whether it's a good or not opportunity, I think it's one of the objectives. And regarding Nathalie Yomb, it's more of an instrumentalization of all these dispositives which are exceptionally linked to Russia and Ukraine to actually try to hinder someone who's been hurting French interests, at least the elite French interests in West Africa.
So how would you actually go about, or what are ways to counter the attacks on freedom of the press in your opinion?
Well, I only can contribute from my point of view as a journalist. So, and first I would like to outline that's really impressive in a negative way to say that, for example, the case of Hüseyin Doğru never received any kind of solidarity from journalists in Germany, at least. I don't know how it's the situation in France or Switzerland with Jacques Beau. But for example, no mainstream media ever published anything on Hüseyin Doro since he was sanctioned. There are a few Junge Welt, Neues Deutschland, like tiny left-leaning newspapers, but like the broad mainstream is completely ignoring this case on the one hand. On the other hand, in the evidence pack, which Juan also mentioned, they have tweets from Hüseyin and then 2 newspaper articles from Tageszeitung and Tagesspiegel who are without any proof, just declaring Hüseyin, before he was sanctioned, that Hüseyin had linked to Russia because he had employed 2 people who before worked for Waptly, this RT-linked video agency. That was it. So you have the European Union, which is using articles from newspapers who are only, without any proof, are claiming something and using it in the evidence paper to say he has to be sanctioned. But coming back to your question, like how to counter this from a journalistic point of view is really difficult because the hegemonic part of German media, or they blame him, or they ignore the case. And the same is also for the trade unions, like Deutsche trade unions for journalists, like Deutsche Journalistenunion or DJV. So it's a really difficult situation because all the central actors in this game, I repeat myself, are ignoring the case or even supporting the sanctions. So I don't really see, besides like the journal I'm working for, the newspaper I'm working for, Ostdeutsche Allgemeine, Berliner Zeitung, and the 2 other newspapers, all the rest, they are convinced really that's a good thing to sanction Hüseyin and all journalists who have supposed to be links with Russia.
And is there a discussion ongoing concerning within the journalistic scene, as you know it, on the question as such, on freedom of the press, of freedom of the media, or is it just taken into account that's just the way it is, and normally everybody follows the narratives that are given?
It's really interesting because I'm covering also on a weekly basis federal press conference of the German government, and all these journalists are really convinced that they're very critical, but on this issue they trust completely the statements of the foreign ministry or of the spokesperson of Merz, like the chancellor. They don't question it. Like, they're able to question certain statements, but if it's concerning freedom of speech, especially Hüseyin Doro, there's something I really don't. I'm questioning myself. Why is nobody questioning this statement of the European Union or the German government? And I think the main argument is really that Germany was able to say Hüseyin Doro, without any real proof, has links to Russia. And in this actual time, the average German journalist says, oh, that might be true, so better not touching this case. If not, maybe I will be also involved or will have problems. So there's a very opportunistic journalistic bubble. And yeah, I'm really sorry, but I can't provide really an optimistic picture concerning Hüseyin Doro and all the other sanctioned persons, at least from a German journalistic bubble, which is very self-referent as well. And it's still a bit of a mystery for myself why they are so indifferent. The only hope maybe I have, like we have also a person who was part of the legal team of Assange. Assange was similar ignored for some time, and then there was, at least in the German context, but only maybe a year before he was liberated, that also mainstream media started to support him or to show some sign of solidarity. So maybe that might happen, but not in the near future.
But do you see a possibility? I mean, you have worked on the legal team of Julian Assange. How do you see? Do you see a way of what is your experience, and can it contribute to spreading more awareness or trying to raise more awareness to the questions that arise? What are the similarities, if there are any?
I mean, Julian Assange was the subject of of smear campaigns regarding his links to Russia before he was subjected to false accusations of rape. Then they would every time invent new elements to marginalize him from the public sphere, because they had a different issue than with, for example, Hussein Daoulou, is that he was a proeminent figure when they started persecuting him. He was everywhere around. Amnesty had just given him his prize of Man of the Year. He was in Time magazine, so forth. So they needed first to destroy him from a reputational perspective, then find a legal excuse to lock him in this specific situation. It was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for years, and then when the excuse, which was in this case the rape accusation, was over, they only then assumed that it was purely to repress him from having published true elements during regarding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at this moment, they decided to put him in prison, and it lasted for 4 years in an anti-terrorist prison, and he was only freed because the U.S. presidential campaign was approaching, and he was about to become a liability for Mr. Biden against Mr. Trump. So they were afraid that Mr. Trump would use Julian Assange as proof of the hypocrisy of the Democrats and so forth. And at that moment, Biden considered that it was better off to let him go. And I think in the assessment was also part of the assessment was the fact that he was already completely destroyed. I mean, more than 10 years deprived of his freedom, all these reputational attacks, so he wasn't threatening anymore. And this is what will happen unless there is a shift in the geopolitical context, and there has been relatively one for a few years because of the change in the US. These people will not exit this locked-in situation because it would be a recognition by the institutions that have sanctioned them that they did a mistake. As long as the context doesn't change, if you desanction them, it means that the motivations you had were not correct ones, and thus that you made a mistake, and thus that you destroyed someone for no reason. And it's not costful for a member of the government, for a member of the Council of the European Union, or even for a judge at the General Court to let someone drown himself. It is costful to go against one of the other parts of the state apparatus that has taken that decision. It's costful for the General Court to generate an evolution in its jurisprudence and to say now we will control further than we did before. And then to have all this pressure from the Council of the European Union saying, why do you decide this? Well, so you prefer following the winds as long as actually there is no political pressure or that there is no media pressure or there is no citizens involved in trying to revert this situation. We're far, far, far from these circumstances. And the media blackout you describe in Germany, but that you could extend to the rest of the European Union, is actually allowing them to continue and to pursue these policies, to expand them, and to generate fear. I mean, I could consider that having defended Natalie was a risk as a lawyer. And the simple fact that this could become a risk will generate deterrence in me, in my potential clients, and this is actually why these decisions are adopted, to generate deterrence, to conform the people around a unified view, which would be to maintain this political stance on the Ukrainian and Russia conflict. And I think there's a lot of actors that have a lot to win to maintain this conformity and to nourish it. And the destinies of a few people are not much in this grand scheme.
And Alexandra, how is this discussed in the legal scene? Because actually, I would imagine that attacks on basic principles and fundamental rights should be reason for a lot of people to question what is happening or to be more critical. Is there criticism concerning the developments in the legal sanction system, or how do you feel that?
In my view, vocally expressed criticism, very little. When I was aware of this sanctions list, and I thought that it raised serious concerns for freedom of expression. But then what really prompted me to reach out to colleagues about this was when I saw that a Russian academic who also writes on sanctions was added to the list for his academic work. And they said that he works with a prominent think tank in Moscow, and they said that he has ties with the Kremlin. So I sent this information to my colleagues because we've published books together. He has participated in edited volumes that I've also written, and I said, our colleague has been sanctioned, and this is the reason they give, and we can see that he's been sanctioned for his academic work. I sent to the sanctions experts that I know, about 20 people or so. I got maybe 3 responses from colleagues saying, okay, if you do something, I would like to be involved. And I got 1 response from a colleague who replied everyone in the email, telling me that essentially I was overreacting and that he wasn't being sanctioned for his academic work, but because he has ties to the Kremlin. And so therefore, he can go to the European Court and just argue that he doesn't have ties to the Kremlin, and everything will be fine. And so if my colleague watches this and he says, I'm calling him out, but I think that he came from...
We don't know his name.
Not yet. Not yet.
He came from like a well-meaning place, but I think it's because a lot of people, especially if you're an academic, and in my view, people are not that critical. I mean, I'm not saying there's no criticism, but I'm like, as far as I know, I'm one of the more critical people of sanctions. So I think that my colleagues tend to kind of trust the system. They trust the fact that we live in the EU, that this is a democracy, that we have human rights and all that stuff. So I think that it's when you're not paying attention or you don't really want to look at maybe an uncomfortable development that there's a risk. Yes. So yeah, and then maybe people feel more uncomfortable with it than they're willing to say, but there's the chilling effect, which is essentially what Juan just described, is like you think if I speak out, it will come at a cost for me. So yeah, and I think it's interesting, we talk about a media blackout, but the press will report on the sanctions against Francesca Albanese, who was essentially sanctioned because she published a report that demonstrated the ties of private companies to the genocide in Gaza, who's gaining from it. So she was attacking the economic benefits of certain private actors in the US, and that's why she was sanctioned. Natalie Yam, you can perhaps draw a parallel, is attacking the economic interests of certain individuals and their operations in Africa, right? So I think there might be a little bit of a parallel there, but nobody really talks about Natalie Yam.
But this means that the developments are really concerning because things are getting broader and broader, and they have basically created an instrument to be used against whatever feels fit.
And I would add, I think that the effect of stigma, like you were saying, that what you say about Hussein Drogo, that has a huge effect on what we are willing to accept. So if we think, this individual has ties to Russia, if you frame someone a certain way, then as an individual, you might be willing to accept, then it's justified that we treat them in this way. Because a few years ago, there's the case of a British blogger. If I'm not mistaken, he lives in eastern Ukraine. I think his name is Philip Graham. I'm not sure. But he was sanctioned by the UK essentially for the information that he has been sharing from eastern Ukraine. And he's been accused of being, spreading Russian propaganda and all that stuff. And he challenged his listing before British courts. And the British court upheld the listing, said that the government was right to sanction him. He's appealing the decision. If he loses the appeal, he'll eventually end up in the European Court of Human Rights, I imagine. But it's been for years that he's been in this legal battle. So, I mean, it's in the EU, it's happened in the UK. Canada sanctioned protesters. When was it? The freedom protest, with the truckers. So this mechanism exists.
And it just keeps on getting tighter,
Yeah.
or limiting the rights of individuals
I think it's
more.
a bit of an illusion to think, oh, it won't happen to us.
Yes, and I think that's a good end of this discussion.
A bleak-
I don't know if a good end.
but a bad end.
conclusion.
No,
Yes.
the conclusion is
Yeah.
that there is a high risk of it going further, and it's very important to speak about it and to open up the public debate as much as possible so that people actually find out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.